I'm grateful indeed to be able to speak to you today. I should introduce myself very briefly. I'm somebody who's a lifelong ISFWP member. I've been a trade union tutor for many decades. I've been a UCU union official. In recent years, after I got sacked as a branch secretary, I've also been secretary of Manchester Trades Council for quite a long time. I gave that up recently. And I basically have decided that now I don't have to work for a living, I'm going to spend my time trying to dig into the history of the city I've worked in for the last 40 years, Manchester, and the surrounding area, and actually try to engage as many of people in the movement today, all generations I should add, in basically recognising that we stand on the shoulders of giants. We are basically only able to fight for what we are aiming for, really, because to a large extent what's gone before us. And when this conference came up, I should say, I decided already to look at the 70s and 80s, the upturn, to use SWP jargon, and that was then basically advised by Ian Birchall that I should take a step back and look at the pre-68 years, and he said, well, by the way, there's a conference. And so that's the sort of how I come to be here, I suppose. And what I want to sort of really do today is to show some of the work that it's still ongoing work, the stuff that on this list that's missing. I've just this week been digging out basically the history of the Irish in Manchester, and when you ask the question of the role of violence as a midwife in the context of the discussion we've just had, actually there's, the Irish issue is a midwife of the left and organisation and the movement in Manchester as everywhere else, and including in the 60s, and I might just possibly have a little bit of time to say something about that. So these are the issues that I basically have put together, and by far from being complete, it's important to recognise that though Manchester is a very, very historic city and all that, actually if you look at it post-war, it wasn't terribly special. Obviously the famous textile industry was disappearing, but actually full employment was maintained, engineering for much of the period was thriving, you actually had a huge housing crisis. That's a picture of Hume. 84,000 people live in Hume. It's an inner city slum, basically, which does eventually get cleared in the 1960s, but it's typical of much of working class Manchester. And what's interesting about the housing, and I don't have a chance to talk about it except to say really that there isn't resistance in terms of any kind of proper organisation to the rehousing which takes place all the way through the period we're talking about, though again there's a lot of complications I should add. I'm actually very keen to dig out the history from below, but I want to write total history. History is class struggle. I'm looking at history from above as well, and I thought it would be worth spending a minute looking at the local state, which is dominated by two individuals. One, both men of course, one is Sir Philip Dingle, who is the town clerk. And it's important to understand in local politics in this period before reorganisation of 74, the town clerk is the man, and the descriptions of how councillors would stand up when the town clerk comes in the room. He would give his report and then not wait to listen to the debate by the councillors, gives you some idea of the power relationship between them. But you do actually, of course, have to manage the politics, and the political manager was the man on the right here who's called Bob Thomas, Robert Thomas. He gets knighted as well, of course, Sir Bob. He's written an autobiography which makes it quite easy to access some of the details about his life, except it's probably the most dishonest autobiography I've ever read. It's going somewhere. And I want to start, and Ian Birchall, who basically is the person who advised me to go back to before 68, I want to go back to 45. That was Ian's advice, and it was a wonderful thing to do, because actually in terms of actually understanding the history of the left and its transnationalism, the first event, and I would argue the most important event that's happened in Manchester from the point of view of the left in the last 100 years, is the Pan-African Congress that takes place in October of 45. And the thing about this is that there is a direct link to the revolutionary traditions, albeit Stalinised somewhat. The key figure is Padmore. Padmore is somebody who is in the Communist International. He's in the Western Secretariat in Hamburg. Before the war, he actually gets arrested and deported by the Nazis. But before that, he's part of the anti-imperialist operation of the Communist Party. Though he breaks with the Communist Party because the Comintern, because Stalin, of course, in the the first steps of the Popular Front policy moves towards an accommodation with France and Britain and the empires in order to be able to basically to meet the German threat, the interests of Russia, of course, and as such abandons the anti-colonial struggle. And within the organisation that Patmore sets up, and I don't have time to go into much detail, there are two key individuals who are fantastic fighters, Peter Milliard and Ras McConnell, who McConnell is the name he takes on basically comes forward from the Ethiopian struggle before the war. And they basically both come to Manchester. And they settle in Manchester and they build a base in Manchester. They actually organise. And McConnell is the astonishing, the exceptional kind of individual who is what I would call an honest and a talented socialist entrepreneur. He knows how to make money and then he makes good use of it. How many of those have we ever met? And McConnell basically creates a whole network of clubs and restaurants and all the rest of it, which provides a safe home for the black communities of Manchester, particularly West Indians who come over to work in factories during the war, and black GIs who are based in the northwest. And they set up the Pan-African Federation in '45, which is basically means that they've got a solid base, and when the decision comes, and again I don't have time to go into it, but there's a Nigerian general strike in the summer of '45, first really big general strike I think in black colonial Africa. At any rate, it's an enormous impact, and this gives the incentive. They've got to do something, and they've got to organise it, and it's Manchester which pulls it off. It's a real achievement. 200 delegates, you've got to find accommodation. You think of the colour bar, which I'll come back to in a minute, which is around. They managed to pull the Lord Mayor to actually, you can't see him with his chains, I think he's somewhere there, to come and introduce it. They managed to run, which is, it's a fantastic congress. I mean, Peter Fry has written about it, a lot of people have written about it, Marika Sherwood has written about it. It's a sort of well-documented event, but I would suggest in a city like Manchester, hardly remembered if we're honest about it. The Communist Party, which is by far the biggest left organisation in Manchester, has real muscle, is there, but not really in any sort of organised presence or anything. This is in the Working Class Movement Library, this programme, this brochure, which, one of the people whose name's on it is a man I'll come to in a second, who's involved in setting the New International Club, which is what I would argue is the inspiration to actually build something in the locality in Manchester that comes out of the Pan-African Congress. The recognition that the fight against racism is not just an anti-colonial struggle, but the people who set it up, set up something which is going to take on the colour bar in the shipping industry based in Manchester, of course, it's a port, on the buses as well. The local labour exchange has a separate queue for black workers. They fight this and they actually get rid of it. They organise solidarity campaigns. Paul Robeson's passport issue, you'll remember. Trenton 6, a bunch of young black men in New Jersey who are being framed. The two men I'm talking about are Wilf Charles, who's the Communist Party Secretary in Moss Side, and Len Johnson, who's a very interesting man who was basically would have been probably a prize-winning boxer in the 1930s if it wasn't for the colour bar that the British Boxing Federation practiced. The truth is, however, that though they set up this very successful organising group centre inside Manchester, in the area of Moss Side, the most important area of the city in terms of the black population, actually the Communist Party loses interest in it. Basically, I think it's not respectable enough, that's my hunch, but at any rate, they basically pull their support from it and it closes in the early 50s. And that means that when the racism erupts in the end of the 50s, around the Notting Hill riot, the anti-black riots in Notting Hill and Nottingham, actually the left is really very, very weak in the city of Manchester. And one way of looking at that is in this story, the story over 7 years of the fight for the Sikh community to have their members work on the buses wearing a turban. That is actually first raised by a man called Sanger Singh. He basically goes to the council and goes to the transport department and says, I want to work. They turn him down, they say it's against the regulations, and they actually then basically block it when he goes with the support of a local Labour councillor to the council and succeeds in getting a vote of the council. They down on the grounds, but basically, it's against the regulations. Everybody has to have the same regulations. The regulations are you've all got to wear the official cap, even though most bus drivers don't wear a cap, but there you go. It takes 4 votes on the council. It takes, ultimately in '67, the final vote, in a situation which has changed. The Race Relations Act has been introduced, there's a local council of community relations, there's nationally there is the campaign against racial discrimination has been set up and so forth. On the basically having been brought into existence following a meeting to London by Martin Luther King, who, if you like, is the inspirer of the campaign against racial discrimination. He goes back to the council. This is his 4th attempt to go, and at that point, in the council meeting, when they vote on the resolution, there's a lot of preparation to be done. They're going to win the vote, and the man I showed you earlier, Bob Thomas, who's also the T&G official on buses, he then basically starts to object, at which point there's actually a riot in the town hall. They have to call the police. The session is suspended till order is restored. It then goes through the union bureaucracy is still opposed to settling it, but actually when it comes down to it, they're able to go through. And this guy, who's the nephew, I think, of Sanger Singh, is the first black Sikh bus conductor. This is 1967. He's finally able to work on a bus. I want to tell one other story, which again reflects what, in many ways, the weakness of the left, because this is the story of a man who is actually a left-winger. He's joined the Labour Party over Suez. His name is Alan Horsfall. And talking to the sort of gay activists from the gay liberation generation, if I can use that term, controversial term, basically my generation, they actually apologise for that. They don't fully recognise, or didn't at any rate in the past, fully recognise the work that was done by this single individual. And I won't, for reasons of time, tell his whole story, but the point about Horsfall is that he's a Labour Party member. He's somebody he's the secretary of the North East Lancs Labour Club based in Burnley. He's secretary of his local CB group. He's a serious, Labour movement activist, and he goes to the Labour Party in that part of the world, Burnley, Nelson actually to be precise, to actually basically get a discussion on homosexual law reform, and he's blocked. He then writes an article, which I do very strongly recommend, which is in something like New Left Review 6 or something, and this is an article which actually details the story of how he's blocked inside the local Labour Party. I mean, very little writing of that quality, in my opinion, is to be found in New Left Review. There's plenty of good stuff, but in terms of real reporting on struggles, I would recommend it as an article. The point about him is he's not an ego, he's a very straightforward bloke, and he then finds himself a year later actually in Manchester with a church meeting room of some kind with maybe half a dozen or so other people, most of whom actually aren't gay, who are determined to support the campaign for homosexual law reform, which is actually based in London, and which is, I'll make this point now, is run by a man called Anthony Gray. That's his pseudonym at any rate, a very well-known figure, a very impressive figure in many ways, who runs the campaign from London, but basically opposes any establishment of local groups. His view of local groups is they go out of control, they do silly things, they cause problems. This is something which you're trying to get a legal change, therefore you really are concentrating on lobbying MPs. It's okay if Alan Horsfall goes to the Labour Party conference and in the bar talks to MPs, but basically you shouldn't do anything like that. Horsfall comes to the conclusion this will never win. This is not the way you're going to change things. What you actually have to do is actually talk to a large number of people. The proposal in this room provided by the church is that they produce 10,000 leaflets entitled Homosexuals and the Law and distribute them as a way of getting things moving. There's a silence in the room when it comes to the question of whose name and address goes to the bottom of the leaflet. And since nobody else is going to put their name forward, and the church has made it clear that they are too many right-wingers who are going to be upset, it's actually Horsfall who says, I'll do it. And he does it for a reason. This is not just simply a wild gesture. This is actually something, his argument is, and has consistently been, this idea that there's a huge amount of working class homophobia is actually false. Anyhow, boy, does this get put to the test. Because what then happens is that his local paper, he's now living in a coal board cottage in Atherton, which is the Wigan area, so northwest of Manchester proper, and he's basically having this leaflet in 10,000 copies all over the place, and his local newspaper, the Lee Reporter, picks it up, and for the only time in its history, Horsfall says, and I'm sure he's telling the truth, actually does an 8-column banner headline. And this is 30 years later, 20 years later, Horsfall holding it up in a meeting, showing people what it was like to have your name, across the front page of the local paper. And the question is, what happens? The editor, he's quite clear, is trying to whip things up, hence the size of the headline. Nothing happens. No bricks through his windows, no attacks, not even any letters to the local lead reporter until the editor desperately gets some of his cronies to write, gets somebody to write one. Actually, Horsfall is then able to go and argue with people. It is rubbish to say that actually if you vote in your, as an MP, you're going to damage your election chances. It's simply it's a myth. There's a huge amount of hostility to get, particularly central in mining areas where the argument was that the men who have to get naked every shift and because they wash at the after 8 hours underground actually shouldn't be in a situation where somebody can, albeit it was only private, but you know what I mean. Somebody, this was the nature of the argument, and basically Horsfall is then able to make sure that Manchester, the only city in England which had a public meeting calling for reform of the law. This takes place at the end of '66, if I remember rightly. Okay, so Horsfall is, again, somebody who works, he's in the Labour Party, but he's effectively working outside of any left organisation. He is a member of the Left Club, but it doesn't actually play any real role in what he does. I've had a few interesting times doing this work, but one of the ones that really continues to frustrate me, and I want to be put right, Bill pointed out to me yesterday that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and therefore to argue that there really was very little going on in terms of women's rights, women's equality, fighting for women's liberation at the grassroots level. I want to be proved wrong on this, but there's a woman who's still alive. She's 96, she's still active, and she lives near me, and she's called Betty Tebbs, and she's got famous recently because she got herself arrested at Fast Lane at the age of 89 and all that sort of thing. But the point about Betty is that she is somebody who's working in the paper industry, and she organises the women on her shop. She basically leads a strike. I could go on and on. She goes to her uni conference. The chair of the conference, who's opposed to what she's saying, it's actually about lifting the ban on communists, says, well, of course, it shows how the opposition is desperate when they put a pretty blonde up to put the argument. That's one of the things that she's held responsible for. And then, I put this photo up. This is 1969, I think, maybe 1970. This is a TUC Congress House, a shop stewards course. This is really, her experience. There are almost 30 people in the room, and she's the only woman shop steward. That sort of. I'm still trying to find more examples of women who are active before '68, but so far I'm still looking. There are all kinds of surges from below, but it's wrong to assume that that's somehow led from the left and by the left. Though they have a role to contribute. One is periodic apprenticeship strikes. I just love this photograph, the exuberance of these apprentices. This is from 1960, this particular photograph, but actually there was apprentice strikes every so often. They would typically, if anybody here is Scottish, you can take certain satisfaction with that. They always seem to start in Scotland, and then they'd be spread by apprentices on motorbikes coming to Manchester, and then the motorbikes would go from Manchester elsewhere. There was a kind of tradition there, and there was no doubt that senior stewards would encourage apprentices to do this. 2 minutes, right, okay. Similarly, there are upsurges in the docks. Again, we could talk a lot about this, but there's something important here, but the reality is that the left are listened to, but they don't really get a huge amount of they don't actually build particularly out of it. So part of the people who are working on the docks, around the docks, are the Trotskyists. There are two people here. There's Harry Ragnar, who even the Communist Party militants acknowledge is the first person in the Manchester area to lead a strike against redundancy. This is in the late 40s, actually. And then on the right, there is a man who goes on to probably be the greatest of all the socialist script writers of the 20th century, Jim Allen, who writes Land and Freedom script and much else and so forth. I'm sorry I don't really have time. I'm doing what Natalie tells me to do, shutting up. Similarly, I want to say something about periodization. 56 is not a big year. I think 66 is the year where, in terms of class movement, it is the Siemens strike. Actually, quote here from Sheila Robotham autobiography, that it's the point where a Labour Party and Labour movement begin to be seen to be distinct. And this is actually not a Manchester photograph, it's London. This is from the Seaman's strike, which famously, of course, people know was attacked. But they're a part of the class in Manchester. And similarly, the bitterest strike that's fought in Manchester in the 60s is Robert's Rundle, goes on 18 months. And what really characterises this incredible amount of solidarity. Here are several hundred workers from a refinery 10 miles away who've come on buses to be able to take part in a mass picket, and there's a huge amount of solidarity for a strike which eventually wins. The man who effectively leads it is a Communist Party member, official man called John Tucker, who goes on to be national chairman of the Communist Party for a period, leaves the Communist Party in 1976. My view is he's a prisoner of the respectability of the Communist Party. He's somebody who understands him organising at the rank and file, but the politics of broad leftism and so forth imprison him. I've got a photograph there of what I think is the respectable face of the Communist Party in Turkey. C&D, I have to mention it. I mean, C&D, I want to come to this argument that movements come from above and movements from below. And from above, you've got this incredibly respectful front line of the C&D demos, Canon Collins and everybody with a shirt and tie. Then you've got the bulk of the demonstration, which is something which is unleashed by the organisers who had no idea what they were unleashing. The first leading figure of the C&D in Manchester is Lord Simon. Yeah, he's ex-Director General of the BBC. Unbelievable establishment figure. Actually, he had no idea what is unleashed. But the fact is that they do try and stop what they see as unauthorised C&D activities using things like the C&D logo. Okay, the new left. I've got very little time. I'm just going to wind up. I was fascinated by Madeline's photograph of the partisan club. What a drabber contrast you could get from the left-wing coffee house in Manchester, a rather tedious Georgian brick, well, I wouldn't say slum, but miserable. Actually, that's founded by 4 Fabians, all of whom go on to become members of Parliament. The most interesting, in my opinion, is Paul Road, talk about. Here we have here. It is true, as Madeline said, Trafford Griffiths is chair of the Manchester Left Club. I'll just finish quickly by talking about the campaign on racial discrimination and say the campaign against racial discrimination basically is another top-down organisation. When a man called Barry Edwards, who goes on to be a Pan-African, actually protests over the black West Indian who gets beaten up in the local police station and tries to organise a demonstration, he gets his house searched. Colin Barker, who's doing it with him, who's an international socialist, gets a visit from the police who try to recruit him as a police spy, and the campaign against racial discrimination call off the march. They get cold feet, which has been planned to protest the police violence. Okay, so I've mentioned most of these points. I won't go on too long. The predominance of movements from above, the Labour Party machine, which is very vicious when it picks on unauthorised activity from below. The movements from below, much of the time, are unsustained. Individuals make a difference. There isn't a women's movement before 68. The established left is getting visibly older. What Satnam Verdi talks about, the racialised outsider, I think is something which plays a key role in what left are developing, but there is a vacuum before 68.
Thank you.